has been around for 46 years. And what's really great about it as a component is that this is something that is available for states, cities, counties, and it really looks at this idea of developing viable urban communities by providing decent housing, suitable living environments. And as we know, for the most part, any of you who've ever heard about them, they are managed and run through the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And I think this is where the interesting twist is, because what we're really talking about then is helping not only at the federal level, but hopefully cities as well to understand that our schoolyard greening projects are urban development, and that they're a vital part of keeping our cities and our communities alive. Who manages these funds? As I was saying, this is a program that rides within HUD's program of office and community planning and development. And it does have specific criteria. So if you want to go ahead and go over to that next frame, we sort of can talk about that criteria. Well, let you move over to the next frame. There we okay. So that's pretty good. So there is then with HUD, their national objectives and criteria, and it really looks at this idea of area benefit activities. And these are sort of looking at what are activities that will benefit all the residents in a particular area. And it is looking at our communities with the greatest need. So one of their criteria is that at least 51% of residents are low and moderate income persons. Next slide, please. Okay. So when we look at this, then what HUD looks at in terms of how they distribute these grants is this idea of what are those eligible activities. And this funding is capital improvements, so it's capital development projects. And they look at it in terms of what is eligible through sort of these three national objectives. And that's meeting a need, having a particular urgency, benefit to low and moderate income persons, and then aid in the prevention or elimination of slums or blight. And I think what's important for all of you to think about is that there's a little bit of education, as I mentioned, that we really need our cities and housing and urban development entities to understand how our schoolyard greening fits into these three categories. And in Denver, we had a lot of conversations with the city saying the urgency is the importance of greening from a climate heat island perspective within some of our inner city areas. We also looked at urgency from the standpoint of displacement and helping communities feel that there is investment in their schoolyards and they want to stay in their communities. We've already talked about benefits to populations of need. And then again, sort of that idea of preventing or elimination of slums or blight is really talking about how do we help communities with displacement? How do we give them the reason and value of staying within their communities? So let's move on to the next one. And I'm happy, I know we're going to break into sessions afterwards, but I think the one sort of piece with this is that as you have conversations with your cities and others, it's really sort of thinking about how do we perhaps reframe our discussion about schoolyard greening so that we can help HUD and cities see the connection with what we're doing with these statutory goals. So let's go to the next one. And I've kind of got one highlighted there in particular, because this becomes sort of a important sort of a component within this. So there's this whole sort of suitable living environment. There are some communities who actually have HUD local action plans that you could be part of. But what I really want to do is jump down to let's jump down to the eligible activities, because I think that's where this really starts to become a discussion point. And here, what I've done is I've bolded in particular what we worked with the city of Denver, and I know what Houston and in Philadelphia that we've looked at. And it's really helping the cities understand, and HUD, that our schoolyard greenings are a public facility and improvement. And they are no different than water and sewer facilities, streets, neighborhood centers, and the conversion of school buildings for eligible purposes. So you can see that description. That description does not say schools or schoolyards. And so it really behooves all of us to begin to have that conversation that sort of talks about that, but we fall within those categories. We're a little bit of everything all sort of rolled in there together. And so that little box that is to the right, they're sort of talking about how do you frame the ask that fits into these HUD criteria. And for us in Denver, what we looked at is we framed that as saying, this is an essential streetscape improvement, fencing and street trees around the schoolyard, as well as some much needed public amenities. And so we were able to frame it that way, even though what we all knew we were talking about was a schoolyard improvement. And so I think these are those nuances in terms of how you frame the ask with HUD to help them understand and educate them about what we're talking about with schoolyard greening. So this really, I can't impress upon you the importance of how we reframe our ask to align with something like HUD and their criterias. We're not there, this isn't smoke or mirrors, right? I mean, what we're talking about are legitimate. It's just really helping them understand how one really needs to look at the importance of urban development in our communities. Okay, so let's go to next. So how does this process and the approval process work? So this can vary from place to place, but typically what will happen is the city, and usually it's their Office of Economic Development, will distribute those community development block grant funds. They can do it to nonprofit organizations or educational establishments, faith-based organizations, or even city departments. The city of Houston.
Hey, hi there. Nice to meet you. Checking out the space.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm not sure.
Remember
nice,
to mute
sure.
yourself. Justin, you're not muted.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so with Houston, their schoolyard greening program, which is about 30 years old now and has been using community development block grant dollars from the get-go, is housed within the mayor's office. And so the city actually then managed the whole project. So you really do have then these opportunities to do it differently. In Denver, that project was done with our nonprofit, which is another way that you can do it. In the city of Philadelphia, we had as part of a greening project, we had a street improvement where we were doing new fencing and we added 60 street trees. That one was able to go through the Office of Housing and Community Development. And we actually were able to tag on to an existing contract with the Office of Housing and Community Development. And so that could happen very quickly. Those monies can happen very quickly. And so this is, I think, a good way to think about that approval process. Depends on, are you trying to take off pieces of a particular schoolyard greening project? Are you trying to do the whole thing? And then what is a good approval process to be able to have that work, particularly if it's in the initial phases and you're just trying to get everyone to be comfortable with this, you can sort of slice off pieces of your schoolyard greening project to use these funds for. Okay, let's go to the next one. So this is, and we're happy to I think, Brenda, we can share, this is a Miro board, which is a great way to be able to show an awful lot of information. But I think that the main piece of this is to be able to take a look at some things to really sort of think about. There will be some type of a pre-application meeting, and that can be depending upon your city and how your city operates. A lot of cities like to have these discussions internal to themselves as they start to agree to this process of using these dollars. And then once all of that is agreed to, and once a notice of proceed has been approved, then you basically are submitting your application describing the capital dollars that you're going to be doing, the work you're going to be conducting. Typically, you would have not started any of your bidding processes for the construction work. You may have already have a set of construction drawings for that and a good idea of what that budget might be. I think a couple of things that are always important to think about, and this is sort of that lower tier within this, is that you do need to follow federal and city guidelines for your bidding procedures. So that could be a typical traditional public bid approach. Whenever you have federal dollars, they must comply with Davis-Bacon wages. And if you are a nonprofit or have done work with state or city funds, Davis-Bacon tends to increase perhaps the cost of your project. So if you are starting to think about how you might be able to use federal dollars, you might want to think about a contingency that's your federal dollar contingency. And that could be anything from 10 to 20 or 30%, depending upon what your rules or regulations might be within your particular city or state funding. And then the other thing to remember is they are last dollars in. So if you are a city, last dollars in is irrelevant because you have a lot of money. If you are a nonprofit, last dollars in are a little bit tricky because you may have to then get a bridge loan to be able to pay your contractors so that you can then be reimbursed at the end. Certainly doable, but again, those are those little nuances that you want to sort of have eyes wide open moving into the process. Okay, let's go to the next one. And so we just touched on this a little bit, but so that construction process does look at the idea of getting your construction drawings approved, having your contractor selected through the public bidding process. And typically you will be assigned a project manager from within the Office of Housing and Economic Development within your city, who will work closely with you to sort of approve every one of these steps. What we have done, and I know what Kathy does down in Houston, is the school district then, in this case, when they're not necessarily the individual receiving the money, for us, we work closely with the school district, obviously getting their approval on the construction documentation, making sure we're following all of their construction specifications and procedures, and making sure that they're happy. So you really are, you are keeping the feds happy, you're keeping your city happy in terms of whatever planning and zoning processes and building permits that you may need, and then also doing that with the school district, which can sounds a bit daunting, but it works pretty well. And I think the one thing to keep in mind with this approach is once you create that precedent within your city and you have everybody buying into this process, the brain damage, if you will, happens a lot at the beginning, but then you can continue to do that. And Houston is a great example. Kathy's been through 5 mayors, and I think they've done about 500-600 schools over the process. And so they have begun to really develop and streamline that process. So it can sound complicated and daunting at this point, but I think it's an amazing opportunity for an influx of funding that people haven't typically thought about. So let's go to the next one. Okay, so lots of stuff here. We're just going to hit kind of the high points in this process. Again, if you are doing this not through the city, but as a third-party individual, then you will be looking at, in our case with Denver, the Office of Economic Development has their accounting technicians. You basically go through submitting draws, demonstrating the work that has been completed, showing that you've paid the contractors for those. The contractors will then have their certificates demonstrating that they paid Davis-Bacon federal wages. And then once those are identified, submitted, those expenses are certified, and then the city will reimburse you for those dollars. So it isn't really that different for those of you who are familiar with doing sort of traditional construction projects. I think the benchmarks that are important here, particularly if you are a nonprofit interested in this, and I'm not quite sure, I'm guessing Brenda and Michaela, we have a variety of individuals in here. For us, it was a little interesting because the city wanted us to guarantee for 3 years after the completion of this project that the property would not be sold or no longer being the intended use would no longer being occurring. Now, I think that is something that can vary from city to city in terms of how you negotiate those components. But there are some little interesting little pieces there that you have to think about. So if you look at the very end there, it says TBS is responsible to ensure improvements remain for 3 years after completion. I'm not sure what we would have done if the school district had not done that, but we were willing to, we were confident enough that the school we were working with was going to be there for the long haul. And so we were all right with being able to do that. We also, although we did do a bridge loan as a nonprofit, because we do not have the kind of dollars to be able to carry the reimbursement process, but we did not have to come up with a line of credit for the full amount because the city was amazingly they really expedited all of their components and really expedited their payments to us. So that at any one point, we really were only looking at a line of credit that was $75,000 to $100,000. So again, that is if you're in a situation where you're not the city, you're not Parks and Recreation, you're not a school district. And I think it's just important for everyone to understand that it is possible to go about this, even if you're just a small nonprofit, or if you're actually the city or some city department within the cities. Okay, so let's go on to the next one. How are we doing on timing, Brenda? Are we okay? Good. Okay.
Yeah, we're good.
I'm gonna assume. Okay. All right. Let's go on to the next one then. So I think as we kind of get to the end, wanted to talk a little bit about, so where has this been accomplished? I've done some digging to try to see if I can find other cities at this point. All I've been able to come up with, and I'm still going to continue to dig, is Houston, Denver, and Philadelphia as examples. And I think Houston is the whole rail of this. I mean, Houston is the oldest schoolyard greening program in the country. It's been, and I've got some little demonstrations down below that we can take a look at, but they began this project using community development block grant dollars because they had a mayor who saw the importance of schoolyard greening for the health of the city as a key piece for urban development and renewal. And so I think that's where I love Houston. Houston also, because of the size of the city, has about maybe, I think, 10 different districts, and we can take a peek at that. Then it made sense for them to keep this program housed within the mayor's office because they were working with so many different school districts. So again, I think each city wants to sort of think about what is the action plan, what is the best relationship that a city can have with housing and urban development. The next one, and we can zero in for Denver, and I know those pictures are tiny. I apologize for that. Oops. Okay, so there's let's go back to those little tiny pictures just real quick, and then we'll jump into these bigger ones. Thanks, Brenda. So for Garden Place Academy in Denver, the $300,000 that we used for from the community development block grant dollars really zeroed in on this idea of greening. We had a primarily Latina community who was very interested in really sort of elevating. We were in the process of greening the schoolyard, but more than anything else, the parents and the principal wanted to have this street face that was representative of the beautiful school, that this historic school that they had. So for us, a street improvement, which is a classic urban development project, just so happens usually it's with commercial properties, made a lot of sense. So here we got rid of the god-awful chain link fence, put in a decorative, more appropriate fence, put in about 65 street trees all the way around the school. Little move, but a very important one. If we take a look at then Philadelphia, similar thing. If you want to slide that over to, go over to Judith, go back up, over, there we go. Teamwork. So this is one of our North Philadelphia schools. That woman there is Judith, and Judith is in charge of sort of taking care of street trees. We had a program with the children who did a competition for creating signage for all of the street trees that we put in. It was a similar thing. If you want to slide over a little bit more, if you can there, Brenda. So this was one where the Pennsylvania Horticultural Society had the contract. We were able to say, great, take $160,000 out of the community development block grant dollars and put it towards bringing back the trees. And in Philadelphia, when all the trees die, the school district would just concrete over all the little tree wells. So this required us to go back in, recreate all those tree wells for the trees, get rid of all the dead trees that were all over the place, get in our new trees. Again, another thing, a decorative fence, sending that message to the community of the importance of the schoolyard. And then we're continuing to work on schoolyard greening. So again, those are three examples. Here we're looking at Houston, which was a much more comprehensive program. Here you can see all the different school districts, 2, 4, 6. So we've got almost 10 school districts that the Spark program was working with. And they were able to then get a very robust budget from the city to do their transformations. What has that led to? Now, the Spark program still uses community development Spark grant dollars, but they also are getting a lot of other funding. So I think you can really, I think a great way to think about these federal dollars is that they may at some time pay for 100% of a greening project, but they're also really, really helpful to take some component. And that might be green stormwater infrastructure. It might be street improvements. It might be public spaces. We spend a lot of time focusing on the idea of public spaces. If we slide over to the next image, so this again, apologize, I know it's tiny, but if you look at, so from 1983, and that's That's Kathy. She doesn't really look like that now, but don't tell her that I said. But she has stayed with this program the entire way through. And the wonderful thing about it is that every single mayor that has come in to Houston has kept this project alive. So from the resiliency and the importance of it, it's been huge. Okay, I think that might be all of our slides. Are we at 15? Yes.
I had no idea what that was.
Yes, thank you, Lois. I stopped sharing, but thank you so much for such a thorough walkthrough on CDBG funding and these case studies from Houston, Denver, and Philly. Really a lot of information to digest, I know. And we will be sharing this Miro board with you. I don't know if I just dropped the link, if it is completely accessible, if we need to open it up, but we will figure that out and follow up with an email. I do see a question in the chat that I will be going into breakout rooms in 2 minutes, but if we want to address it now, it's from Melody, and it says, are you hiring a project manager for these schoolyard improvement projects with the HUD funding? How are these managed? Who are they managed by?
So you can't really use the HUD dollars to hire admin people, which is always, our great irony with all of this. And I think that's where it's always important to really try to look at a palette of funding that helps you with whether it is soft costs, whether it is program related dollars, and soft costs, their admin program, and then capital improvements. I think the one thing that is interesting is I think that the federal government is starting to understand that perhaps they have to be able to allow for that. So it becomes a kind of a tricky piece. We have talked with the city of Denver, for instance, to be able to say, okay, let's look at some other sister funding that can allow us to have the funding that we need. Otherwise, for our work, we just end up saying, all right, this is part of our grant management. This is part of what we have to be able to do. Once you do get, so for instance, in Denver, we were able to have funding to provide community organizing and support. So we had some big community volunteer projects. We also wanted the community to be part of the design process. So we were able to include within those CDBG funding those kinds of costs, but they were not covering getting the HUD funding, but after the fact, once you've got the funding, they could support efforts that were going on with it. So I hope that helped.
Thank you, Lois. So we will be moving into breakout rooms to continue this discussion on a smaller scale. We'll be going in there for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll come back and reconvene here. So I'm going to open up the rooms now, and I'll drop a few questions you don't need to follow them. They're just prompts for you to get started as a group, but yeah, feel free to chat on your own. Open all rooms.